This is now the fourth discussion regarding the American government. The first was the wonderful government set up by our godly founding fathers. The second dealt with the Congress. The third dealt with the presidency and how the Congress and the presidency have worked to bring down this nation and to destroy it morally and financially. Now we'll talk about the Supreme Court and its role. Now again, the Supreme Court has done many things that are damaging to this nation. However, I'll just mention some of the critical things that you may or may not have thought of. I'd like to read a quote by Thomas Jefferson. He and the founding fathers initially thought that the Supreme Court was probably the most dangerous of the three institutions set up at the federal level, and for good reason. And to some extent, that's been true. Remember, the original purpose of the Supreme Court was only to judge 5 different areas, according to the Constitution. They were not to produce precedents for legal purposes. They were only to judge the case on its merits, with no precedents involved. And they were only allowed and given the authority to judge those 5 kinds of issues. Here's Thomas Jefferson's quote. "It has long, however, been my opinion, and I have never shrunk from its expression, that the germ of dissolution of our federal government is in the constitution of the federal judiciary, an irresponsible body, working like gravity by night and by day, gaining a little today and a little tomorrow, and advancing its noiseless step like a thief, until all shall be usurped from the states and the government of all will be consolidated into one. To this I am opposed, because when all government, in little as in great, shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of our government or another, and will become as venal and oppressive as the government from which we separated." End of quote. At first, the Supreme Court had very little to do. They met in the basement of the House of Representatives because they only had 5 things to do and no power to create any precedents or to do any particular damage. But that soon changed. In 1803, there was a case called Marbury versus Madison, in which Chief Justice John Marshall said, "The Supreme Court is the exclusive and final arbiter of what is constitutional and what is not." The Supreme Court was never given that ability. They were never given that right. They were never given that responsibility. The Congress was the one that determined what was constitutional. The states determined it, and the people determined it, not the Supreme Court. In 1816, there was another case called Martin versus Hunter. And in that case, they basically said the Supreme Court's decision are above the state Supreme Courts, and the federal court is in charge of interpreting federal law. That's way out of line for what the Supreme Court was designed to do. In effect, they usurped the authority of the states, which created the federal government, to be a servant to the states. In 1819, there was a case called McClellan versus Maryland. The Supreme Court said it got its power from the people, not the states or the Constitution. Power of the people. How do the people have any influence on what the Supreme Court does? It's very much like federal land. They say it belongs to everybody. But you can't go without permission or unless you pay a cost. You can't do anything on the federal land unless they tell you can. So commonly owned land doesn't belong to anybody. Nobody's responsible. Same thing is true with the Supreme Court. No one is responsible for their actions. And it also said that, again, that in that same case, 1819, McCall versus Maryland, they determined for themselves that they have the right to determine what the Constitution means. That means they could interpret the Constitution any way they want. Their job was to determine what the Constitution meant according to the founders and follow it, not to change it. There was another case in 1936 called the Butler case. Now, the Butler case just showed some of the violations that the Supreme Court has allowed or encouraged. I'll just mention a number of them. The Butler case and others put these together. They allowed and approved of pornography, which has been a destructive effect on the morality of the country. They made abortion legal. Prior to that, it was illegal. There were very few of them. Now, men and women believe they have the right to have intercourse anytime they want, have a baby, and kill it right in the mother's womb. And we've killed almost 60 million Americans in the womb, where they should be safer than any other place on earth. Well, that's, what, 1/6 of the number of people in the country. We've murdered 1/6 of all the people in the country. Well, that's more than the Nazis and the Chinese and other vicious civilizations have murdered. They stole the authority from the states. The states are now servants of the federal government and not the master. They suspended prayer in school. Having prayer to the God of the universe, the creator of the universe, is now illegal. But in many schools, because the governments run and finance the schools to some extent, it's required. Every once in a while, the kids have to dress up as Muslims and pretend they're Muslims and talk about how great the Muslim religion is. And other things are allowed, but not Christianity. Christianity was the foundation of this nation. In 1936, that case of the United States versus Butler, the Supreme Court said the Congress doesn't have to follow the Constitution anymore. If you would read the short but ugly document written by Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, you will find that the Congress for many years now has been following the Communist Manifesto and entirely ignoring the Constitution. In the past, before 1936, all laws had to be passed in such a way they benefited all citizens. By allowing the Congress to determine what the Constitution meant and ignore it if they want to, now the Congress passes laws many times to favor politicians, to favor companies, to favor certain groups in the nation. And in doing so, they rob some people to take care of the benefits of others that they want to give. Instead of benefiting everybody, they turn one group of people against the other. Rich against poor, young against old, one race against the other, different ethnic groups against one another. They're creating this problem and making it worse as the years go by. As a result, the Supreme Court has been a destructive element in this nation. There is the ability to impeach these people, but there aren't enough honest congressmen to do so. That's the reason, it's one of the reasons, that's one of the trends that has caused so much destruction in this country, especially in the last 100 years or so. I hope you find the information helpful and recognize that as citizens, we need to do what we can to retain our freedoms and to resist voluntarily doing things which enslave ourselves.